Now, Hapool got dressed up specifically to make an announcement this afternoon, and so I'm going to invite him to come up here, and I think it's kind of a promotional announcement that he has in mind, but...
No dressed up.
Actually, I have to stop promoting because I'm all out of the little brochure, but I'll get you next month.
I think generally speaking, he was talking about the Veterans Memorial, and they
I
were...
don't know about it because I was having to
Okay, so you've heard Hap talk about this before.
one reluctant guy to work on, but having a conversation, he's not paying attention.
Okay, thanks, Hap. Okay, now we've come to that point in the program that you've been looking forward to after you've had a good meal and your brain has been stimulated. I think that you're in for a lot more intellectual stimulation by our speaker. But I'd ask John Bucky to come up and introduce our speaker at this time.
Unfamiliar face at this table is, it's mine, but I don't think so. It's Ed Fowler sitting here, and Ed is just coming off a session that he had at Doncaster this morning on world affairs, and he does this on Tuesdays, two Tuesdays a month, and lively, and Ed is spends a lot of time boning up on Mid-Eastern international world affairs. And usually the sessions start with Charlie Rose interviews, and we go from there. Those of us who are still awake, and Ed has a propensity to ask good questions and keep people alive. Ed was born and raised in Idaho, which by itself is not necessarily a tip-off of fascinating adventures to come, but nevertheless he found his way east and graduated from Princeton in 1953, which is the year after I graduated from high school. No harbinger of greatness there, I think. Next came a stint in Japan and the United States counterintelligence from 1954 to 1956. He graduated from Yale Law School a respectable 3 years later. Ed's varied skills and interests have taken him from Chappaqua, New York, to Washington, D.C., and now to Doncaster and Keene Valley, New York. But the real reason he's here, and I think this is where it all, maybe not, this is dramatic to say this is where it all began, but he's retired general counsel for the Mobil Oil Corporation, and he headed the international legal team that negotiated with Saudi Arabia and other Mideast oil producers to resolve their nationalization of Mobil's projects in the late 60s. A decade later, I think, further negotiations freed up oil supplies during the Arab oil embargo after the U.S. had decided to support Israel in the 70s. On the nonprofit front, Ed has been chairman of the board of the National Symphony Orchestra at the Kennedy Center in Washington. He's the former president of Yale Law, Yale, L-Y-A-L-E. Is that how you pronounce it? Yale, maybe. Law School Association in New York City, and is active in various major conservancy-related activities in Keene Valley, New York. Since moving to Doncaster in 2007, his preparation for bi-monthly World Affairs groups has deepened his insight insight into the conflict in the Mideast. Anyone reading the newspaper or has watched television or has some awareness of the complicated morass confounding the men on the street, newscasters, and our own State Department will know that this is a mess. If any of us thought we had the answers to the Mideast situation, Ed will explain to us that for every solution there is at least one other side of the story. So Ed is going to clear everything up for us, and you ought to be happy and content because everyone has had a piece of cake. So we're ready for Ed.
I know from experience my voice is not very good well. Can you hear me out there? Put a hand up if you can out here. So he's going to crank up the volume. Well, maybe I'll just I'll just hold it. That's better. Just hold it. Okay. Let's just do it that way. John, I don't know where you got all of that stuff. I'm married to a woman who really likes to plan ahead, and a month or two ago she said, hey, you know, we should write our obituaries. And so we did, you know, just in case. We're in pretty good health. Did she loan you my obituaries? Where that came from. Anyway, mention was made of an appointment. Here it is, 26 after. And Carolyn is her name. She said, you know, sometimes you talk a little longer than folks want to listen. So she fixed that by scheduling a dental appointment that happens moments after the scheduled closing time here, John. So I can promise you. John mentions Doncaster, where we live. Every 2 weeks on Tuesday at 10:30, we have something that we call the World Affairs Series. Lasts an hour and a half. Public is invited. Usually about 60 or 70 people show up. We have an interview from somebody. It may be the president of Iran or Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, whatever, for 30 or 40 minutes to form a background for a discussion. Lots of people show up, find it interesting, and don't feel compelled to say anything. But I go through this only to say everybody in this room is welcome. Any day, any of those Tuesdays, and John here could tell you the dates. And he comes over, and one of our most valued participants. John handed out maps, and it isn't that this is a map reading course here this morning, or actually it's now afternoon, but unlike you, most of you who would be expert cartographers, if somebody asked me to draw by hand a map of the North Africa and Middle East, I would flunk the course. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on the maps. I just thought it would be a convenient reference as we mention some of these countries. The stated subject is the Arab Spring and the law of unintended consequences. Now, most people in this room would know what I mean when I refer to the Arab Spring. We watched a lot of this on TV, starting at the end of 2010, but really picking up speed in 2011. There was, throughout North Africa and the Arab countries of the Middle East, and keep in mind, Iran is not an Arab country. Iran is Persian. Most everything else in the Middle East is Arab. But you have these revolutionary public protests in the streets and the public squares of North Africa and the Middle East that numbered in the tens of thousands. Started in Tunisia, there on the north coast of Africa, where President Ben Ali was deposed as a result of these public protests in 2011. He'd been in power, running that country for 23 years. Just a month later, we remember those massive protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo, President Mubarak, who had been running Egypt for over 30 years, was deposed. So after those two examples of sudden change, not people with guns, but people just in the streets, it all seemed kind of magical. And so the protest spread throughout the Arab world. Damascus and Syria, you name it, it was happening. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia to a much lesser extent, as we'll come to. Now the rulers in those countries responded in very different ways. Some, like Morocco, folks here put their hands up, you've been to Morocco? Wonderful country. The king there is a very popular guy, but people thought, hey, it's a king, we don't have democracy. So they were out in the streets. And he has survived as king by making a variety of political concessions, transferring to elected officials some powers he used to have. Elsewhere, as in Saudi Arabia, very wealthy countries, they succeeded in keeping the protests down, mainly in Saudi Arabia by a combination of spending a lot of money and the police being pretty active. I think we all know in Libya, Gaddafi simply unleashed the full power of his military on the protesters who were mostly peaceful. And that led to the intervention, military intervention by the U.S., NATO, and the Arab League, with our air power to keep the rebels in Benghazi from being massacred, which surely would have happened. But then in Yemen, on your map, we don't hear too much about Yemen in this country, right south of Saudi Arabia. That's really a messed up country. But the president, a guy named Ali Salah, who'd been there for 33 years, was chased out, went on exile to Saudi Arabia, when finally even his military turned against him. In Syria, we know President Assad and his father had run that country for 43 years, a long time. And of course, what happened there was the demonstrators in the streets of Damascus were very peaceful, but he just called out the police and the military and just went after them without mercy, and that led to, of course, the calamitous civil war that we all read about every day in Syria. So now, these protests in the streets were all in the name of democracy. People were saying, we want a change of government. These guys are running this place with the military and the police. We have no rights, and we need democracy. That was shorthand for a lot of other issues. As we go through this a little bit, it won't be any great detail, keep in mind two things. Because if we have 5 minutes for discussion, I'd like to give at least one of these questions to you. First of all, back in 2010, 2011, would you have ever predicted the outcomes that we'll go to here in a minute? What happened? What were the results? And mostly, not all, mostly were completely unintended consequences. That old law of the unexpected. Well-intentioned actions producing calamitous results. Secondly, the United States played a role in all of this, and we'll come to what our role and policy have been. What do you think about the policy and the role of the United States? Now, we get to the present. That was 4 years ago when it started. We'll come back to those 4 years. As far as the outcomes are concerned, I'm going to read to you an analysis of a noted Arab commentator, not an American. He happens to be the Washington bureau chief of the leading Arab satellite television channel, very much respected guy. And here's what he says has happened. He says, Arab civilization, such as we knew it, has broken down. The Arab world today is more violent, unstable, fragmented, and driven by extremism the extremism of the rulers and those in opposition, think ISIS, Islamic State, okay, than at any time since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire over a century ago. Every hope of modern Arab history has been betrayed, he says. The promise of political empowerment, the return of politics, the restoration of human dignity, heralded by the season of Arab uprisings 4 years ago, all of this has given way to civil wars, ethnic, sectarian, and regional divisions, and the reassertion of absolutism. The jihadists of the Islamic State, in other words, he says, did not emerge from nowhere. They climbed out of a rotting, empty hole, what was left of a broken down civilization, with the dubious exception of the antiquated monarchies and emirates of the Gulf, which for the moment are holding out against the tide of chaos, and possibly Tunisia. There's no recognizable legitimacy left in the Arab world. Now that's an astounding, possibly somewhat extreme characterization, but that's his view. Talk about unintended consequences of the Arab Spring. Now, so many questions come to mind. Were these young protesters, and most of them were just young people, were they on a fool's errand? Were they encouraged to an extent by the Obama administration's calls for democratic reform? Or were these pretty much home-baked revolutions with only local ingredients? Or was the supposedly democratic government the United States installed in Iraq, was this an inspiration for the protesters? Or on the other hand, were the disastrous results of that effort a reason for Arab rulers to resist anything like it at all costs? Now, a brief digression. We Americans, I think, have been taught, to have a generally positive feeling about revolutions in the name of democratic self-government. After all, ours turned out pretty well. We beat the King's Army, we set up a new government of our own choosing, and after just a few years, it was made to work pretty well. Maybe not so well currently, but back then anyway. But it's important to note, how did all this happen? I mean, the revolution was a tough war, but afterwards, we didn't have all that much of a problem getting together with the national government and state governments. The difference is between now and in the Middle East and America in 1787, we Americans did have a pre-existing colonial culture of shared values that respected the concept of representative government. After all, our real complaint was we were being denied the rights of Englishmen. Taxation without representation. We wanted somebody in Parliament. How could they tax us with no representation? So the pre-existing British model of representative government and colonial government structure, with some major surgery, and the Articles of Confederation at Philadelphia in 1787, provided a political basis for new representative government in the United States. To the contrary, and here I quote from a recent article by New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. In the Middle East, he says, the young people were trying to tear down their autocratic, non-democratic systems, but underneath was not a civilization with a shared experience, habits, and aspirations of democracy. Instead, it was a toxic mix of Islamism, tribalism, and sectarianism, ridden with religious conflicts of epic proportions, and especially since the Iraq War, culturally hostile to Western values and institutions. Not exactly fertile ground to plant some new model of Western democracy. So anyway, what inspired all of this? Who were the original protesters? Anyway, whose idea was it? Some people assume wrongly, that it was somehow planned by militant Islamists, and that's just not the case. Most of the original demonstrators were, of course, Muslim, because the whole area by religion is Muslim, but they were distinctly not militant Islamists with religious goals. They were simply members of the population, mostly young, as I mentioned, many educated young people with an array of non-religious grievances and secular goals. In fact, Al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri was reported to be surprised and angry at the protests, which were generally peaceful, because he believes violent jihad is the correct path for martyrs to install the so-called new caliphate. But of course, the fact that the Muslim organizations were not the originators doesn't mean that once the events were underway, they would be uninterested in the outcome. Certainly in Egypt and Tunisia, the well-organized Muslim Brotherhood was quick to join the fray when it came time for a public election. And in both of those countries, they in fact won the first post-revolution election for a new parliament. And that result has actually been reversed in both countries. In other countries where the government fell, producing chaos and civil war, as in Libya and Yemen, the vacuum of power opened the opportunities for militant jihadists to take a major role, and they certainly have. And the most extreme example, of course, is Syria, where Assad's vicious response to the Arab Spring produced a chaotic civil war that made it possible for the Islamic State people and their like to flourish, as we have seen and continue to see. So what was on the minds of the demonstrators? Certainly much more than just a desire for democracy in the abstract. There were frustrations and motivations that were much deeper and broader than that, namely demands for an acceptable standard of living and an existence that includes respect for their individual human dignity. It has been said elsewhere that the Arab Spring, at its essence, was really about two things: economics and human dignity. On the economic side, unemployment and crushing poverty have prevailed for years in most of the Arab countries. Over half of all the people are under the age of 30. More than 25% of those people are unemployed. And those same deprived and frustrated people saw flagrant corruption amongst their own rulers. And as the third big goal was to free themselves from harassment and disrespect by the regime's police, especially the secret police, and that was really endemic in countries like Libya and Egypt. So those of us who watched these demonstrations on TV will recall that in many of the demonstrations, the placard slogan was, "Give us human dignity." Now, so these conditions and frustrations have been existing for many years. Why was it that it was not until 2011 that all of this came to the fore in such a dramatic way? Virtually all knowledgeable commentators that I've seen agree that it was the advent of the new electronic media. Starting just in the last 6 years or so, a frustrated young person living in poverty in North Africa or the Middle East could for the first time see daily on Al Jazeera and satellite TV displays of the life of the rich and famous, including Arab leaders. Some of those TV channels were actually producing independent political commentary criticizing their leaders. And not only television, but more important really, the open internet have broken the government's ability to control the flow of information. Concerned citizens can now not only know what was going on, but with the no social media like Facebook, Twitter, old-fashioned email, they could communicate amongst themselves in large numbers to try to do something about it. For example, to summon hundreds of thousands of folks to a demonstration on short notice. That's exactly what happened. Starting in Tunis, then Cairo, on to Damascus and beyond. One statistic, there are 51 million people on Facebook in the Arab countries, which is more than all the newspaper readers. I don't know where I ran across that, but it impressed me. Okay. The fuse that set off this Arab Spring tinderbox was in December 2010 when a fellow named Mohammed Ouzazi, a 26-year-old street vendor, set himself on fire on a main street in Tunis. He had not been able to find regular work. His fruit cart had been confiscated by the police for lack of a peddler's license. He was completely frustrated with life and decided to put an end to it in a way to make a statement. And so the television was there. His way of exiting, as they say, went viral on Arab TV. To many young Tunisians, his protest was a call to action against their own experience of unemployment and abuse by the authorities. And so they took to the streets in Tunisia, mostly nonviolent demonstrations. And within a very few weeks, President Ali had fled to Saudi Arabia. Now, where's the United States been on all of this? There's actually just no mystery at all about it. In May 2011, Arab Spring had been underway for 6 months. Mubarak was gone, Ali was gone. President Obama set a date for a major pronouncement. It turned out to be a 45-minute speech, much of which was broadcast by design and intent on Arab television. And it was an unqualified call for action to reform Mideast governments. What President Obama called, quote, a new chapter in American diplomacy. Referring to the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, he said, those events should not come as a surprise. Quote, the nations of the Middle East and North Africa won their independence as nations long ago, but in too many places, their people did not. In too many countries, he said, power has been concentrated in the hands of the few. A new generation has emerged, and their voices tell us that change cannot be denied. Now, continuing on, Obama said, the question before us is what role America will play as this story unfolds. We have a stake not just in the stability of nations, but in the self-determination of individuals. The status quo, he said, is not sustainable, so we face a historic opportunity. Then, finally, these important words. Specifically, he said, it will be the policy of the United States to promote reform across the region and to support transitions to democracy. Now, for Arab regime leaders, hearing or reading Obama's speech, the call for transitions to democracy must have sounded very much like a call for regime change. These pronouncements, together with America's earlier abandonment of Mubarak in Egypt, did not go down well with Arab leaders in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, who were longtime friends, principal oil suppliers, allies in the fight against militant Islam, and cohorts in opposing Iran's nuclear ambitions. Now that policy statement by Obama contrasted sharply, intentionally, with what had previously been listed as America's core interests in the Middle East. And these have been announced a few months earlier, not as something new, but just a recital by a senior administration official, namely, first, to ensure the uninterrupted flow of oil, 2, block the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, 3, protect key allies, especially Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Israel. 4, counter terrorism and political violence. And finally, promote democratic reform. An expert on these matters has recently said that in the past, promoting democracy and political reform had at best been given lip service as a core U.S. interest. But in a sense, that really changed with the Iraq War when President Bush and the administration introduced the idea of a democracy in Iraq. I don't argue with that. It was simply the fact. They could have made a choice. You may recall, a lot of you here, after World War II, John J. McCloy was High Commissioner of Germany. We didn't suddenly install an elected government. That was a fairly different setting, for sure. But anyway, we have the sorry history of after Saddam Hussein's Sunni minority had been running the country all those years, putting a so-called democratic elected government in place where Maliki, Shia, majority guy, didn't see much use to include anybody from the Sunni side, much less the Kurds. So the 3 principal ethnic and religious groups in Iraq did not end up in a unified government. And you all know what's been going on in Iraq, and it's really a tragic example of an effort to install democracy where the folks who were in charge forgot about the principles of shared responsibility. Now, each of the Arab Spring countries has a really fascinating story to tell. If we had another hour, we could go around the map. It's so interesting. Let me generalize, and then we'll come back to 2 or 3 unusual cases. 2 o'clock is the witching hour, right? Okay. A bit of a surprise. The absolute monarchies, the governments headed by kings and princes and emirs who were never elected by anybody, the absolute monarchies are uniformly survivors. One might have expected that these unelected hereditary leaders would have been the most unpopular, most exposed to pressure for change, but not so. In this class you have Morocco, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, the United Emirates on the Persian Gulf, including Abu Dhabi. On the other hand, the fellows ostensibly in office by reason of public election or public choice of some sort, who in 2011 came to be called villains and dictators and worse by their subjects, these guys, claiming to be the people's choice, have done less well. They're either in jail, dead, or in exile. We already have a list: Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Saleh in Yemen, and Gaddafi, who of course fared the worst of all. Syria is in a class by itself. The returns are certainly not in on how President Assad will emerge, if he does at all, from this. Early on, some optimists thought he might accept exile someplace, but when Russia said, "Not here, thank you," that idea faded. And with no safe place to go, it's hard for Assad to retire and give up his job when he's hearing talk of international prosecution for genocide and crimes against, just to digress for a second, with respect to Assad, if you want to fault, I'm a big supporter of Obama, but he's made some mistakes. This was certainly one of them. You don't say as he did, Assad has to leave, the international community will not permit him to stay, with no plan to make that happen. You just can't engage in bluffs and have your bluff called. It's as simple as that. Now, from the vantage point of the people's welfare, the people who live in these countries, what happened? Tunisia, it's not only the place where this all started, it's the poster child. It's the poster child of the Arab Spring. It's the one country where it seems likely to have an enduring representative government. The Islamist Party did win the first election, but they've stepped aside recently for fairly complicated reasons, not the least of which is that 3 opposition fellows got assassinated and folks thought they had orchestrated that. But anyway, last month in a new election, the secular party won over the Muslim party. They're now forming a coalition, national unity government, and it looks favorable. Lesson for us Americans, I don't know how many people voted last week, 30% nationally here in our country, 60% of the eligible voters in Tunisia showed up to vote. They seem to care. In Libya, the country just fell apart. It's now in chaos, a failed state where various militia groups have banded together with hardline Islamic militants versus a loose coalition of militias under a renegade former general. There's not much chance of democracy or even a decent life for the people of Libya. Egypt, you know that the Muslim government, the Muslim Brotherhood got elected. They had a parliament. They forgot that in a democracy you have to be inclusive of others. They attempted to repopulate the leadership of the military, but the short of it is that, as you know, in a military coup they were sent packing, and the military is now back in control in Egypt, just as they were before this all started. Saudi Arabia, the Arab Spring really never got started there. The royal family is allied closely with the fundamentalist Wahhabi clerical element in Saudi Arabia. And for openers, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia simply issued what they call a fatwa in 2011, declaring that public demonstrations violate principles of the Quran. So that was pretty much it for any protests in Saudi Arabia. Otherwise you get picked up by the clerical police. And to help out on the economic side, the very wealthy leaders, royal family, put together a multi-billion-dollar spending program that was of direct benefit to broad segments of the population. Yemen, you may wonder why we care about Yemen. It's a little country down there, but we care very much. It's been a hotbed of violent Islamist jihad for many years. Under the previous regime, the US CIA and military had a close relationship with the military there. Then, after Salah was sent packing, a new government was reconstructed that was pretty friendly to the US. Now that's gone because just 2 weeks ago, right out of the blue, a rebel group called the Houthis, H-O-U-T-H-I-S, I'd never heard of them before, but they apparently represent a huge segment of the population, simply came into the capital city, took over all the government offices, and claimed they're now the government. Not much stability in Yemen. In Syria, of course, there's nothing much I can add to the plight of the Syrians that you don't see on television every night. Now finally, how about this question of American policy? The policy announcement by Obama back in 2011 that I read to you was on its face addressed to each and every monarch, king, emir, and president in the Middle East. The reality, however, has been that the group of oil-producing Persian Gulf monarchies have not been subject to any serious American demands for democratic reform, much less regime change. Here, the Obama administration, and I must say, to my mind, wisely, chose stability over the possibility of the chaos and turmoil that could have resulted from serious efforts at regime change. I'm tempted to give 5 examples, just one. Bahrain. Bahrain is an island in the Persian Gulf. It's ruled by a king named Hamad, and he is of the Sunni sect. The Sunnis in Bahrain are a small minority. They're running the country. The majority are Shia. The protests in 2011 were on behalf of the majority Shia population, simply asking for more representation in the government, and of course, worries were that things would get out of control. Neighbor Saudi Arabia, also Sunni, keep in mind, simply sent troops and armored vehicles. The United States didn't do anything to protest that except try to avoid violence. And today, King Hamad still rules Bahrain, and Bahrain continues to be safely the headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet that's policing the security of the Persian Gulf. Very realistic decision, not very democratic. So finally, after 4 years of all these young people demonstrating in the name of democracy, their dreams being pretty well frustrated and turned on its head, except in Tunisia. And that, coupled with the failure of the democracy experience in Iraq, and I don't mean to be totally pessimistic, that country may someday find its way to stability. We wondered, who's responsible? We certainly can't blame the young people with their cell phones in 2011. We certainly can blame rulers who just decided on totally inhumane responses like Assad in Syria and Gaddafi in Libya. There's a lot of blame to go around. And we come back to this question, was it simply untimely and improbable to think that trying to transplant Western democratic governments in an inhospitable environment where there's no shared consensus or history to support it is a good question. So I think my own view of the history of our U.S. policy here is that it's an object lesson on the importance of combining long-term aspirations and efforts toward dramatic change with the realistic need for assuring enough stability, enough law and order that ordinary citizens can go about their daily affairs with at least a minimal level of personal safety and sustenance for their lives. I guess my closing comment would be, this may seem a little bit odd, but the French revolutionaries in 1789 had to wait for 59 years through revolution, counter-revolution, mass executions, and dictatorship before emerging in 1848 with a representative, functioning democratic government. I guess our best hope would be that survivors of the Arab Spring and their progeny will fare better than that. Thank you.
Entertain any additional questions? Should there be some?
I would be fascinated. I'm not saying that the United States caused the Arab Spring demonstrations. Nobody can quantify the cause and effect relationship. In 2011, Obama said what our policy was, but that's not the first expression. 2 years earlier in Cairo, Obama had made a big speech on Al Jazeera about America supporting representative government and rights of individuals. I don't know how much of that translated in the minds of thousands of young people in the Arab world, but it does raise the question, this just did not work so far. Do we fold our tents and say, hey, we're not carrying the message of democracy in the world? Do we just give up and say, hey, the consequences can get out of hand? What do we do? How do you measure realism? Yes, sir, I'd love to hear.
I think her name was Elizabeth Patterson, wrote a book, 1952. And the thesis of her book was that there was Arab rage. That among the Arab countries, treated very badly, and that to try to go in and tell them now what to do just increased that rate. Would you have anything to say?
I certainly do. She's absolutely correct. The phrase you see repeated is that the Arab, Arab Muslim, let's just say that they're synonymous, though they're not always. The word is humiliation. They feel that they have been humiliated by the colonial, and certainly since World War I, when Versailles conference, we divvied up the Middle East. Some happy people got lands that they wanted, others didn't. Redrew boundaries, but it goes back earlier than World War I. There was the time, as many people here know, and I don't have the centuries right here, the 1600s certainly, when the Muslim civilization flourished. And a lot of literary, intellectual work was done way in advance of Western Europe. So they do feel humiliated, put down, and suddenly we're back saying, oh, we have some new ideas for you. Right. That's a very apt comment. Any other reactions here? Okay, I really appreciate the chance to be here. I hope some of you would consider coming over. You don't have to feel like you have to make a speech, but we have some very interesting sessions with our World Affairs series there, and you're always welcome. Thank you very much.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.